Welcome to another Catholic International podcast. I am here with Reverend Dr. Avelino, a former Vatican official at the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, the current pastor of St. Matthias Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and a faculty member of ours at Catholic International. Welcome.
Thank you, Emery. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited. We're going to talk about so many different topics, particularly Catholic social thought. Father Avelino has been incredible. You've done so much for Catholic International and really making Catholic social thought a foundation of so much that we teach and so much of the formation of our students. But first, I really want to talk about your life story, how we got here. You're from Cuba. Your family were political refugees. So tell me a little bit more about that. What was it like fleeing Cuba?
Yeah, I was quite young, so I left when I was about 4, so I don't have really a living memory of that period. But of course, everything is filled in by the stories that you hear growing up in the family. But yes, it was of course the late '60s, almost 10 years into the Castro regime, and things were really falling apart. And so my parents basically decided that, they had 2 kids, so the future was not going to be in Cuba. And that was an incredibly difficult decision because, everything they knew, their family was in support system and everything was in Cuba. So to leave Cuba, and it was to leave not just like temporarily, it was leaving Cuba really for good because you weren't ever to come back. And that leaving was very difficult because you weren't allowed to take any pictures when you left. You left as persona non grata, and they didn't want you to have any memories of your families or any memories of the culture in Cuba. So it was a very traumatic way to leave a country, as I heard from my parents who often talked about that time. We went to Spain because my grandfather was Spanish, and so they briefly were in Spain for a while in Madrid, and then eventually through my uncle who was already in the States, through his in-laws, we eventually made it to the U.S., arriving in New York City and then making it down to the D.C. area. So I pretty much grew up in Maryland, the D.C. area, and then went through grade school all through. Went to Thomas Stone Elementary School in Mount Rainier, Maryland, just outside of the city, and then around 3rd grade went into St. Mark's in Hyattsville, Maryland. So I got a Catholic education beginning around 3rd grade.
Okay. So you were raised Catholic, your family was Catholic?
Yes, raised Catholic. My parents were culturally Catholic, and then they went through a powerful conversion experience in the charismatic group, or the charismatic renewal movement. That really changed their lives. So I grew up, in high school, and they were going to retreats or were going to pilgrimages. Their life were really transformed by this awakening of their faith and in the charismatic renewal. So it was beautiful to have that and to see that change in them.
That's beautiful. What changes did you see in your family after that experience?
So basically, church became their life. Scripture study, prayers before meals, living really. Making the family an ecclesia domestica, really. God was front and center and was always the subject of conversation. My parents did marriage prep for the parish where we grew up, and so they would do that in our house, and I would come home from school and often hear my parents talking to young couples, kind of doing the marriage prep. So that's the type of environment that I grew up in.
Did your family teach you about Cuba, the regime there, and why they left?
Yeah, so you grow up listening to these stories because it becomes part of your family history, but also part of your identity. So you hear all the stories of difficulties. First, how wonderful it was, before communism came into Cuba, and how the church, people could go to church and it was part of, just a culture, and that type of thing. People were free to engage, and like my parents on my father's side were initially very poor farmers, and then through hard work, very hard work, eventually got out of the farming into the city of Camagüey, Cuba, where I'm from, and they went from that farming economy to a small business owner, which was like a general store. And so in that general store, they made enough money to then give an education to my parents' generation, and then they were able to get an education, unlike my grandparents on my father's side. So all of that was possible in a pre-kind of Castro regime where hard work really paid off, and you built something for the family with regards to private ownership, private property, a nest egg of savings where you can then, from that, help your kids become educated and move on in life. So those stories were there, and then of course all that came to a drastic end in 1959 when Fidel Castro took over. The great, you have to realize that with this type of transition politically, families are torn apart. So that was part of the tragedy, that my parents left and part of the family stayed. Some people were for the government, some people were not with the government. So that political reality really tore apart most Cuban families to this very day. So it's a tragic reality, because then you leave and you don't have a whole section of your family that stays behind for whatever reason, but those ties are just, they're left behind.
Right.
And that's really one of the saddest things that happens in that reality. It shouldn't happen. I mean, that's why Catholic social teaching is so important. Injustices need to be treated in a way that builds the family up, that builds the ecclesia domestica, that builds society, not destroys it. So this is, I think, one of the attractions for me anyways for Catholic social thought.
That's amazing, yeah. One of the consistencies I've seen in those that have fled Cuba or Venezuela or similar regimes is that they talk about how quickly it changed. What are some pieces of Catholic social teaching that we can look to avoid, these changes into a communistic regime that can happen so quickly?
That's a great question, and it always goes back to the human person. So the bedrock of Catholic social thought is always the defense of the human person, the family, and working towards the common good. The common good being of society in general, are not just what's in it for me, not just a common good for my group that I associate with, my political party, but whatever is good for the common, for society, or the common man. If the focus is always that, realizing that there can be ultimately no good at all for society if the individual human person is not protected, if the individual person and family is not protected. Whenever you have anything, any political system, any ideology that begins to work towards the destruction or the demonization of any particular individual, then you have a recipe for disaster. And that's what history teaches us. I mean, that's a no-brainer, as they say. Just look at what's happened, not just to Cuba, not just to Venezuela, but to any other of the regimes that have gone through this. And you see the same thing, a horrible fracturing of society, and not just that, but a collapse of culture, a collapse of the economy, and then everything that goes with that. So that's something that all societies have to really keep the litmus test, the canary in the mine shaft, is how are we treating the human person from conception to natural death? The minute you start to make the human person a commodity, the minute you start not protecting human life in all of its forms, then you're on the wrong track. So everything depends on really that key essential paradigm. What good are we doing for the human person in general and society, not just my own ideology. It's not an easy thing because there's conflicting ideas of what is good for society. So then there's the additional test that you got to go through, which of course is finding out what is the ultimate good, what is good and evil.
Right.
And then there you get into natural law, philosophy, faith and reason. We know what's good because it's been shown to us basically through faith, scriptures, and also just reason. There are some things which are reasonable. I mean, you can say, contrary to, say, relativistic thoughts of society, no, the raping of a person is, no matter what generation, what time, that's an evil thing. Doing injustice to somebody in general, those are just basic things of natural law that we can all agree should not be allowed in any context. So yeah, they are absolutes, absolutely.
Right. And like you said, it ties back to that upholding the dignity of each and every individual human person to never be used. I also wanted to ask you about your early adulthood. You worked as a civil servant for the Naval Service Warfare Center. Tell me more about that and how that formed you.
Yes, that's a mouthful. Also known as David Taylor Research Center, which is in Carter Rock, Maryland. It's basically a Navy lab that does research and development and testing and evaluation of surface ships and submarines. I was privileged to work there as a mechanical engineer right out of college. I went to Catholic University of America, studied mechanical engineering, started working there right out of college, and worked there for 12 years. So it was an unbelievable experience, learned so many things. And the main task, or the main thing that we were working on, was submarine silencing early on, and then surface ship silencing. Basically, in my particular area, reducing what's called sonar self-noise, the background noise of a sonar, which determines the life and death of a submarine in an undersea submarine warfare. So whoever detects the other submarine first survives. Right. And that is dependent on your ability to detect a signal from the enemy submarine, and that's dependent on how loud the background noise is. So if your background noise is too high, you're not going to hear the submarine as far as possible. The lower the background noise, the further out you're going to hear the submarine. I'll give you an analogy. If you and I are talking right now, but if there was like a stereo all the way up to 10, we would have to yell in order to communicate. Why? Because we couldn't hear each other because of the background noise. Nevertheless, if we reduce that noise to 0, then we can actually whisper and talk to each other, because the background noise is so low, and therefore not just whisper, but you can be further away. And I can listen to you if you're talking on a regular, but now further away. So that allows me, lower background noise, lower self noise allows me to detect, say, an enemy submarine in a much further out. So I became an expert on the sources of that background noise and how to reduce that background noise to maximize the performance of a sonar.
That's what I was going to ask, is what are the sources of that background noise?
The main source is basically own ship noises, systems, what's that saying? Is I could tell you, but I had to kill you.
Right.
No. Some of that stuff is sensitive, but it's physics. Basically, the submarine is the sonar is in front of the submarine, so anything behind it is going to be affecting the background noise. So machinery,
Gotcha.
flow noise, and propeller noise, all that type of stuff. So reducing those sources is really the art of submarine silencing.
Okay, that's amazing. One of the reasons I wanted to ask you about that is I think it's so amazing that you went from that career really in engineering to then joining the priesthood. How did that happen?
Now that's a long story, but it's a beautiful story. It basically is like many things. It's a gradual process of conversion, where I basically realized that God was trying to get my attention, and He did that in subtle and sometimes not too subtle ways. When I realized that God was trying to get my attention, and it wasn't just my imagination, I basically became a seeker, and I began to search out, who is this God? What is this all about? And I explored other Christian churches because I didn't really know my faith. I didn't know my Catholic faith, even though I had gone to Catholic primary school. I had graduated from Catholic University of America, but I didn't really know my faith because I wasn't living it. And I needed to claim it. I needed to really understand it. And it wasn't until I realized that I was really ignorant of my own faith, then I realized, okay, I got to start learning my faith, because I don't know anything about it. I don't know the basics. And that quest just took me. I began to read this book and that book and this magazine and that magazine, and I realized that it was going to take me a lifetime to really get to where I wanted. So I started to search out for just formal courses in theology, and I found a school in Northern Virginia, not too far from here actually, which was at the time called the Notre Dame Institute, later became the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College. And I just started taking courses at night school. I went to engineering. I would travel, miss some classes, but then come back. And then eventually, over the years, I think I took all the courses required for a master's, and the next thing left was just preparing for the comprehensive exam. So, which is kind of interesting. I graduated in June of 2001 with a master's in theology from the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College, and that August I entered into the seminary.
Wow.
Now that's 2001.
Okay.
Which should ring a bell, because it's two major things happened that year: 9/11 and the Boston, priest scandal. So it was an interesting time to enter into the seminary, but nevertheless, here we are.
Right. I saw such an interesting analogy there when you were talking about your time in the Navy, and then when you were listening to God's voice. It's almost like you had to lower the background noise, right, to hear Him.
Absolutely. Now, that's a beautiful analogy, and I actually started a book some years ago. Hopefully I can finish it one day. The book is called Self-Noise, how to apply the techniques, the art of background noise silencing to the inner heart.
Right.
And so that we can hear the signal, of course, and the book is the Word of God.
Right.
And so there's techniques we can use, and we have to identify the noise sources and the distractions in our life so that we can actually hear that whisper, because the Lord speaks to us in a whisper, the Elijah paradigm, where the Lord was not in the earthquake, the Lord was not in the storm, but rather He was in the breeze of the evening. That's how God speaks to us. It's that sort of that moment in I think the Prince of Egypt animated movie of Moses. I love that rendition where Moses, as a young man and shepherd, he hears the voice of God calling him Moses, Moses, and that's how I see, my calling too. The Lord had to show me how to really just lower that background noise so that I can really hear the voice of His voice, and with all the distractions. And that's really a beautiful thing when you realize, no, that's God's voice. That's not mine.
You've been a pastor for a long time. What background noise do you hear most often from those that you've pastored, that they're not able to hear God's voice because they're too focused on X, Y, or Z?
Great question. We're living in a time of great noise, physical noise with all the mufflers that are now on these cars, and I hear them driving by the parish because our parish is on a main road, and we hear that all the time. So we're living in a time of incredible physical noise, but also incredible spiritual noise, distractions, whether it's social media or just disinformation in the media, and different opinions. And then there's just the noise of families not getting along, and those personal sources of noise. So it's quite challenging today. I would say from my perspective, it's for anybody, especially young people. It's today we're living in a saturated background noise of distractions, constant music, constant noise, and the music is just very in your face. Mm-hmm. So it's great, challenging times. Nevertheless, God is always calling, mm-hmm. and if we lower the noise, if we lower our internal noise, we can hear His voice. I tell somebody in my parish who is going through a spiritual time in their life, which is very dry, go on pilgrimage. Anywhere from, go to the city, to the basilica, where you're surrounded by beauty. You're surrounded by the great open space of a basilica, of a shrine to Our Lady, the beautiful aesthetics. That's so important, mm-hmm. just to be steamrolled by beauty, and allow oneself to be steamrolled by a sacred art, by beautiful, holy imagery, which is why it's so important to have holy imagery in our houses. Mm-hmm. By the way, I tell people all the time, you got to have a crucifix in your room. You got to have an image of Our Lady, or the two hearts. It's important to be surrounded in a world of images, because that's the language, mm-hmm. of our culture is imagery. It's important to be surrounded by that imagery, going on pilgrimage. That kind of, it shakes up the routine. It mm-hmm. gets you out of the same environment. For families, I recommend that. Go take a pilgrimage up to the shrine of Elizabeth Ann Seton. It's only about an hour, maybe an hour and a half away, and you're at the tomb of the first American saint. And not far from there is the National Shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes. Beautiful place to contemplate, pray a rosary, and go with your family. So, and that's all very accessible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Just cut out that background noise and just
the routine.
Listen.
You gotta really do something to break up the routine and cut out the background noise. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you began studying theology and eventually, you joined the seminary, how did you know this is what God's calling me to do? Not be a great, husband, father, have a family, but to enter the seminary.
Another great question. You don't know. Mm-hmm. You enter the seminary to discern what is God's will for your life. So it's important. It's an important point, because the seminary is a place of reducing that background noise so you can actually hear the voice of God through prayer. You enter into the mystic rhythm of the liturgy, You're praying the Liturgy of the Hours. You're praying, which means you're listening to the voice of God through Scriptures, which is one of the main sources of how God speaks to us, through just quiet time, through Scriptures, through adoration, and of course the sacramental life through daily Mass, daily communion. You have a spiritual director in the seminary, so you can bounce things off of that spiritual director. It's a wonderful thing, and for those seminarians that discern out, they look back on that as a wonderful time in their life where they grew incredibly, and that makes them hopefully a good husband and father in the future. So yeah, you don't enter really knowing, but exploring. Okay, I think you're calling me to be a priest. Can you confirm this? And can you tell me more? That's really, at least from my experience, I think that's how it works, and that's how it worked. And the Lord is faithful. He in my case, I'll speak for myself, was unrelenting and telling me, no, you didn't make this up. It's just too many things fall into place, and you realize, okay, I get it. This is your plan. So, and we're free. We're free to say yes or no. But the analogy I always use for my vocation was that as a priest, the priesthood is like that extra card. When you're playing poker, you get the 4 cards when you're playing poker. You get that 5th card, and that 5th card is like a Joker's Wild, and that's the priesthood. And the Lord tells you, you can reject that card if you like. I'm not going to love you any less. But just know this, that not everybody gets that card.
Wow, that's so beautiful.
And if you do play it, if you do play that card, I'll promise you I will be with you along the way.
Wow.
In a very exceptionally close way. He doesn't tell you what's going to happen because that could scare you to death, but he just says, I'll be with you, and we're going to do some great things together.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love how you put that, because I've seen so many that have gone through this almost religious vocation scrupulosity, where they fear, what if God is calling me to this? If I reject it, will he still love me? You know, and it can really become an anxious experience for a lot of people. So I think that's so beautiful that the way you put it is that it's a call, but if you say no, he's not going to not love you anymore.
Right.
It's amazing.
That's not the God we love and worship. He's a loving Father. So, he wants the best thing for us, but he respects our free will. So it has to be a team effort. We have to cooperate with grace. Of course, that's how the church speaks. We cooperate with grace, and then God does great things with us. And sometimes, you can say, I don't want that option, and he says, okay, you're missing out on a really good thing, but I'll love you anyways. We'll do something else that's going to be great. And being a husband and being a father, that's a great thing too. So it's a win-win thing.
That's beautiful. Since your time in Washington, D.C., serving in this diocese, a lot of your work has been focused around interfaith dialogue. Can you tell me more about that? I think that's such a beautiful mission.
Yeah, I remember the phone call when I got from Archbishop Donald Worrell. He wasn't cardinal at the time, but he asked me to be the assistant director to the office for the Archdiocese of Washington in ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. And I said, sure. I hadn't studied that. It was just a totally new area for me, but it was the beginning of a beautiful experience. And so eventually the director kind of retired from that, and he asked me to take over that office. So I became the director of the office. And for 7 years, I was working as the director of the Office of Interfaith Dialogue. And here in Washington, there's a beautiful and I think it's the oldest interfaith council. I think at the time it was called the the Washington Metropolitan Interfaith. It wasn't a conference. Now it's called the council. But and that was just incredible. We meeting other faith leaders from every tradition, from Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, all these different religions. And here in Washington, we're very blessed to have such a diverse community of faith. And just listening to what they were dealing with, and I found out, hey, they're kind of dealing with a lot of the things that the Catholic Church is dealing with. How to transmit the faith to the younger generation. That's a huge problem across the board. And so when you begin to realize that they're dealing with very similar things of families, the creep of secularization in the faith community, all those things are very much are common things that we deal with. It's good to know that you're not alone. Mm-hmm. And on special events, we kind of get together. When there was a crisis, we get together and put we would generate a statement from the faith community on certain aspects that was happening in the community. So it was a great exposure to just the art of dialogue, and
Mm-hmm.
that's an important concept, because we're losing that in our society. The church is very keen, very aware on the importance of dialogue, and that in the word dialogue is of course logos. So the church is always going to be open to dialogue, because there's the truth, the logos of God. But I think it's so important to really be people of dialogue in a world that no longer speaks to each other, and we're all in our separate cocoons, and the demonization of the other, which reminds me of course of what happened in Cuba. But when you start demonizing groups, then there is no dialogue, and the tragedy of that is that when one's dialogue breaks down, then you have violence, then you have war. And that's not a good thing.
It's so true. I think that especially in this time and culture, there's been so much tribalism where we just determine that somebody who has a different view of mine, whether it be religious, whether it be political, they must have bad intentions, right? It's almost as if they must be out to get me, right? And so we need to put our guard up. How can we get away from that? What does the church teach us in terms of how to dialogue with those of different views?
Yeah, the church has a beautiful method for dialogue, and I learned that when I was working for the Vatican on an international level. And part of that, there's a dialogue of love, there's a dialogue of truth, and there's the dialogue of life. And those three are really key to the church's vision for dialogue. Dialogue of love is the recognition that, I have to pray in order to come together. We're talking ecumenical. In the ecumenical world, it's a prayer for unity, that we all become one. The full visible communion is the goal for the Catholic Church in regards to ecumenical dialogue. So that dialogue of love is entering into the love of God, the love of our Lord, who basically, before he went to the cross, prayed that we all become one, or that we will all remain one. So the spiritual side of it was spiritual ecumenism. You can't generate unity without grace. That's clear.
Grace for each other.
Praying for each other, yeah. And praying that we deepen our own relationship with God in our own faith tradition. If I'm not connected with God, then it's all about me. But if I'm connected with God, then that one God is going to open up my heart and mind to work toward and to desire unity. If that's gone, then I'm just there to push in a political agenda, and that gets us nowhere.
Would you say that a desire for unity begins with a desire for the good of the other person?
Yeah, that's clear, and there's also in an international, and I would say, where's my experience in kind of the local, the one of the key elements is the rereading of history together. That's important because we all come to a certain problem of lack of unity from different perspectives. So there's something about listening to the other person's perspective, the rereading of history of events, to see what their perspective is so that I can kind of get out of myself and listen to their concerns, listen to their tragedies and their wounds that perhaps we have done as an individual, talking about or a community that sometimes we don't recognize we've done. I often use the analogy of a divorce and a marriage. When there is a conversation to avoid divorce, these conversations are very difficult because there's a lot of wounds. But part of the healing is listening to the other person speak and tell their perspective on how that relationship really transpired, because it's quite different than our own perspectives. So in order really to get beyond the division, the woundedness, there's a rereading of the history of the relationship, and sometimes you gotta go back, which is often difficult, of very tragic moments in the relationship where there was injustice or lack of justice done, injustice, and when you begin to see the other person's perspective, you begin to realize, okay, there's a side here that that I wasn't aware of. I did damage. I was a cause of damage and injustice on this other group, and I can see that. I can't deny that. And I have to deal with that, and that leads into a very important level, which is the moment of where going through that very difficult history, the rereading of history, you then end it with a not an apology, but asking for forgiveness, and that asking for forgiveness, which John Paul II really taught us in the Jubilee year of 2000, where John Paul, and some people criticize him for it, but John Paul understood the importance for the Catholic Church to ask for forgiveness for all the times that we hadn't treated our brothers and sisters, whether it's in the ecumenically or interreligiously, for those things, for that damage done by the Church. Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, my hero, basically asked for forgiveness. In the year 2016, there was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and the Lutheran and the Catholic Church produced a document, which is a beautiful document on what has been done in the last, say, 50 years of ecumenical dialogue. And it's called From Conflict to Communion. It's a beautiful title because it tells you that through this openness, through this rereading of history, through this mutual asking of forgiveness, there's a movement from conflict. There was a time when Catholics and Lutherans were, not too long ago, mind you, there was a huge chasm between the two, but now that is not there the way that it was before. So that's a progress in ecumenical movement towards unity, from conflict to communion. We're not at full communion yet, but boy, we're in a lot better place than we were before, and that trajectory is an important trajectory that I think the world should listen to, and that we in the United States of America should listen to, The church is going from conflict to communion, and it seems like in politics we've gone from communion to conflict because of ideologies which are now so entrenched. There's that, just to perhaps finish that point, you hear often where, President Ronald Reagan would get together with the House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill, and after a day of perhaps heated debate on certain political issues, they would go off and have a beer together. Those days are tragically over, and they shouldn't be, because that was a time when, hey, we can disagree on some very fundamental things, and yet leave that aside for the greater good of just being friends, or breaking, in this case, drinking a beer together.
Right.
And that's important for the whole ecumenical movement too, because a lot of these dialogues end with, let's say, dinner together, and that's a huge point.
I think that's so beautiful. The older I get, the more I realize it really does start with the family, and what we experience in our relationship in many ways is an analogy for the way that the world works at a higher level. I love that example that you gave of the divorced couple and having to truly just be vulnerable and see the other person's side, which is really scary.
Yeah, so dialogue is a way to approach it. This process and method of dialogue is important, recognizing that you ultimately can resolve a problem unless you dialogue. Once dialogue ends, you have violence, you have war, and that's really what we're seeing today. So Catholic social thought, which has the primacy of the person at its center, and has all these principles, of course, of subsidiarity, working on the local level to resolve tension, to resolve problems. That's important. That, by the way, is something that the U.S. kind of realized several presidencies ago and several decades ago under Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She realized that most of the foreign service officers of the State Department were not trained in religion. They were basically illiterate with regards to religious affairs, because they weren't trained in that. And that was getting us into problems in our diplomatic outreach. So under her leadership, basic religious training became part of the foreign service officer for the State Department, and that helped us correct some of the problems of diplomacy that we were unfortunately and often unintentionally creating. And so that's true for, and Catholic social thought is all about resolving things on, say, the lowest local level, but also understanding that I have to always keep in mind the primacy of the person to build up humanity, the common good. And if a technology or a policy is not building up the common good or defending the individual, then there's a problem there that needs to be resolved. There's one of the principles of sort of solidarity. Another principle of Catholic social thought goes back to Aristotle's concept of friendship. And a friendship is something that is the glue of the polis of society. And you establish friendship by learning in the family the virtues. So you begin, if you have the virtues that establish the friendships among the citizens of the city, then you have a chance to have peace in the city and justice. So you're right, it goes back to the family. If we don't strengthen the family, if we don't start teaching in the family the basics of fundamental respect for the human person and the environment and other things, education, the family, all those things. If we don't start seeing the value of that in training people in the family from that nucleus, then the polis, and I would say the nation and the world, is really gonna not live in friendship. This is why it's so important to apply these principles, which are timeless, to what we have going on today. What is the option? The option is to live in constant war, constant death. Live by the law of the lex talionis, which is an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. But that doesn't work, because then you just inflame hate, and then it's like, okay, if you kill one of mine, I'm going to kill 10 of yours, or you get down that road, and you just have a bloodbath. No one wins. So it's critical for our time.
It's so true. It's been interesting to watch the growth in media over the last really decade. There's so much, and some of it might be helpful for dialogue, and some of it may not be helpful. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Yes. So in dialogue, part of the rereading of history together, it clarifies images of each other. So we all tend to paint images of our enemies or our friends, and today that those images are quite polarized or not even real, with all of the social media, with all of the imagery, TikTok and all this. It amplifies the negative, and so those images are really distorted. That's the danger of disinformation and corrupt media. Corrupt in the sense it's corrupted from the truth of the reality, and that's true. 500 years ago. It's true even more now with technology. So when you have the technologies today that are magnifying the negative images of the persons that don't think like you, then you begin to create a monster of that person that doesn't think like you, because you're in that echo chamber. And there's a lot of talk about that echo chamber today in social media. People are just kind of listening to what they like. So, and there's so much disinformation out there that just creates that image of a monster for the person that is not thinking like you. That's complete. I mean, that's incendiary, but it doesn't take you. That's the opposite of dialogue. That's shutting everything down out of fear, because that's the end goal of that is to create fear of the other. And once you have fear of the other, then that's a dangerous place, because then you want to eliminate fear by eliminating the other. And that's kind of where we are tragically today in some of the politics and some of the global tension, is that demonization through a corruption of the image of the other that is just magnified by disinformation and social media. So that's a hard nut to crack. I don't know how. I guess the only way to really address that is just speak more truth, and create forums for dialogue, where we can actually get away from all of the disinformation, the exaggerations, the demonization, so we can actually have human beings talking to each other and retelling. Okay, let's reread history from your perspectives, and it's not an easy thing, but it has to happen. And I think the faith community is in a position, really, is the only voice out there that can really make that happen.
You probably saw that a lot in your interfaith dialogue work. Were you surprised at what you learned about those of other faiths?
Yes, you're always kind of refining that image of the other and also the image of yourself. When you listen to someone and they tell you something perhaps that you didn't know about your own faith, you learn, and that sharpens your own image of yourself. I'll give you an example. One of the most beautiful things about my experience in the international ecumenical dialogues was the sharpening of my own faith. I was in a trilateral conversation or dialogue with the Mennonites, the Lutherans, and the Catholics, and we were talking about baptism, the initiation, the sacrament of initiation. It's amazing how much I learned about my own faith and listening and contrasting with the other positions of the other faiths, and also how much commonality there was. So it is an incredibly enriching. This, I would say, one of the misconceptions of ecumenical dialogue is that it's a waste of time because no one's going to change their minds, and that it's a watering down, the least common denominator. If you do it right, it's not that. I give you, sometimes you do have that, but I would say done right, it's a mutually enriching phenomenon. And we really need that because we need to sharpen a sharper focus of our own image. And sometimes, like I said, when you hear someone saying something not good about what your community did or your faith tradition did, you become humble. And humility is a required variable in the equation.
So beautiful. I'm really thinking through this conversation of dialogue and thinking about how biblical it is, right? That when two or more gathered, there I am. And as you say, dialogue comes from the word logos, which, is Jesus, right? He's the word. So that's just so beautiful. I think where two or more are gathered in good faith, right? Be the right way to say that, right? Is, as you say, when you see the good in the other and are willing to see their perspective and see history with them, not necessarily to change your own perspective, but maybe to humble you or to just be present to that grace, whatever it is that God's calling you to in that moment.
Well, let me perhaps just kind of refine that a little bit. The goal of ecumenical dialogue is full visible communion in truth. The goal of interreligious dialogue is heightening the knowledge of each other so that we can avoid conflict and work together to resolve the great issues of our time, the great problems of our time. So they're different goals, but yes, an ecumenical dialogue, this requires two people that actually want to dialogue. Now, you can't have dialogue when someone doesn't want to dialogue and they think that you're that monster or that you're always going to be wrong about. Dialogue only works if there's a sufficient amount of humility to say, I might be wrong about some things. But if in your mind there's no way you could be wrong about anything, and the other person are the monsters, the other person are the devils, the other persons are the Hitlers, that in your mind there's no good at all there. See, that's a problem with exaggerated disinformation. It's binary. There's no in between, and life isn't that way. Life is complicated. I mean, I'm a sinner. I can be really good one day and perhaps not so good the other day. I'm off my game, and my humility that I should have through those failures tells me that I'm not going to be right about everything. So there's a humility to dialogue that says, no, I can learn from somebody else. That's the one thing perhaps I wanted to tweak, which is, I'm always going to learn something by engaging in dialogue.
Right.
And that's part of the beauty.
That is really beautiful. So to wrap up here, I wanted to talk about Catholic International University and the work that we're doing. Our mission really is to bring education from the heart of the church to all communities where they are, right? So that somebody doesn't necessarily need to come to the United States, but they can be impacted by education and then impact their communities. And so relevant to our discussion and relevant to your work at Catholic International is Catholic social thought, right? So how can, and it's a silly question, it's something we could talk about for hours, but in simple terms, how can Catholic social teaching, Catholic social thought impact communities all over the world through their education at Catholic International?
Well, what we're doing at Catholic International is I think something unique. I was asked to kind of design this course, and what we're doing is something that is unique because it's going to foundations. So there's you can get a certificate in Catholic social teaching or social thought at the university, and the first course in that certificate program is foundations. So we go to the classical foundations. We begin with ancient Greece, Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. We get into Augustine, and then the medievals, St. Thomas, and then see the change, what I call the anthropological turn of modernity, and how that changes all the categories, where there's no longer God in the center, but man, and that leads us down a very, very long and tragic path. Not to deny all the positive things about modernity, of course, but that the dimension of displacing God as the center good for society, that has tragic circumstances, as we know from the 20th century. It all goes to Auschwitz, basically. So what we're doing in Catholic International is kind of seeing the broader picture and seeing how Catholic social thought is a response to the great crises of history. Sometimes, at least in my experience, when you take Catholic social thought courses in Catholic social thought, it becomes a data dump on encyclicals. You read this encyclical, Leo XIII, the Rerum Novarum, some points, or even you just kind of touch on the pillars or the principles of Catholic social thought, and then you hit those and read something on that. I've seen that, and it's not exciting. It remains too abstract. What we're trying to do in this at Catholic International is to ground it in history, and ground it in the philosophical and theological tradition that builds and informs the mind of the church, that Athens-Jerusalem connection that forms the mind of the church, so that by the time the great crisis of the Industrial Revolution comes around, Leo XIII can address the so-called social question with that bulwark, if you will, of knowledge based on the sacred tradition and sacred scriptures, of course. So that's what we're trying to do at Catholic University, much more than just a studying of principles, and or even using the principles for I would say slogan political activism. It's much more than that. It's an anthropological reality, and if you don't get that, then you're just going to be really treating the superficial problems and not getting to the anthropological realities.
It's beautiful. And given that it's rooted, like you said, in that truth, that historical context, it can be applied to all communities, right? All cultures,
and
regardless.
Times.
Yeah.
Yeah, and times. All cultures, all times. There are endless values, timeless values from faith and reason, and that's key. There's in the Vatican Palace, and you go to this in the Vatican Museum, the room of the paintings of Raffaello, where you have the School of Athens, and right across that beautiful painting of the School of Athens, you have the Disputatio, which are the great bishops and theologians, and they're worshiping the Eucharist. And above the Eucharist, of course, is our Lord with a Trinitarian, manifestation of the glory of God. And that's really the church goes back and forth in those two traditions, the School of Athens and the Disputatio of the Lord, the discernment of the understanding of the Incarnation. And that's what allows the church to really apply that great heritage of philosophy and theology to the problems of the world. That's exciting, and I think any young person that really knows, the meaning of that, the tools that gives you, should be excited as well.
Yep, I'm excited. Thank you so much, Father. Such a great discussion. I'm excited to continue with more discussions. You're such a value to us at Catholic International, so thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you, Emery. Appreciate it.